Imagine a sweltering afternoon, August 9th, in the distant year 378 AD. The Roman Empire, which had already conquered lands from every corner of the ancient world, now faces a crossroads. One decision, one mistake, and everything could change. This is not just another battle. It is the moment when the fate of Rome hangs by a thread. Can you imagine the weather? The dry soil of Thrace, the heat that made the soldiers sweat beneath their armor. Emperor Valens, a man convinced of his own glory, gazes at the horizon. On the other side stand the Goths, a people fleeing the Huns and who only wanted to survive. But history, as always, has its unexpected twists. Rome has always seen itself as invincible. It was common back then to hear that the gods are on the side of the Romans. But on this day, confidence turned to arrogance. The generals argue, the advisors warn, but Valens ignores the warnings. Why wait for reinforcements if he believed he had the power to crush the invaders? After all, this was the Roman legion, renowned throughout the known world. But there's a curious detail about this moment. The Goths, despite being called barbarians by the Romans, had their own organization, charismatic leaders, and experienced warriors. Fritigern, their leader, knew how to wait. While Valens saw haste, Fritigern saw opportunity. And, as an old military proverb says, he who controls the time controls the battle. Most intriguingly, no one there knew, that morning, that they were about to make history. No legionary imagined that their names would be remembered for centuries. No Goth warrior dreamed that on that day, the invincible Romans would be defeated in open battle. Before we continue this journey full of twists and turns, consider, how many times in history has an empire fallen not to the enemy's strength, but to its own choices? And what remained of that Roman pride when the dust settled at the end of the day? If you enjoy delving into moments when the world truly changed, get ready. The Battle of Adrianople is more than a battle. It's a mirror of human weaknesses, hasty decisions, and the consequences that span generations. Let's unravel this story together. This is the Battle of Adrianople, a clash that shattered Rome's invincibility. Before we unveil this epic tragedy, smash that like button, subscribe to Legacy of Empires, and ring the bell to join us on more journeys through history's turning points. Picture this. The year is 378, and the Roman Empire is facing something it's never quite dealt with before. From the endless steppes of Central Asia, a force so terrifying that entire nations flee before it, the Huns. These nomadic warriors, masters of horseback warfare, are sweeping westward like a human avalanche, crushing everything in their path. Now, the Goths weren't exactly strangers to war. These were tough, battle-hardened people who had carved out their own kingdoms north of the Danube River. They were skilled warriors, fierce fighters, and proud of their independence. But when the Hun war machine rolled toward them, even the mighty Goths knew they faced annihilation. Imagine being a Gothic father, watching the horizon darken with Hun riders. Your children cling to your cloak as rumors spread through your village. Entire tribes wiped out, cities burned to ash, warriors who never returned from scouting missions. The choice becomes brutally simple: flee or die. So in desperation, something unprecedented happened. The Goths, these proud people who had fought Rome for generations, came knocking on the empire's door, not with swords drawn, but with hands outstretched, begging for sanctuary. Picture the scene: Gothic ambassadors standing before Roman officials, swallowing their pride, asking their former enemies for the one thing that could save their people: safe passage across the Danube into Roman territory. Emperor Valens saw opportunity where others might have seen danger. Here was a chance to solve two problems at once. The empire always needed more soldiers, and the Goths were renowned warriors. Plus, having them settle in the sparsely populated regions of Thrace could actually strengthen the border. It seemed like the perfect deal. The Goths would get safety, Rome would get loyal soldiers and settlers. But here's where the story takes a dark turn, because human greed has a way of poisoning even the most sensible arrangements. The Roman officials in charge of this massive refugee operation saw dollar signs, well, gold coins. These were men who had clawed their way up the imperial bureaucracy, and they weren't about to let a crisis go to waste. When 200,000 Gothic men, women, and children crossed the Danube, they found themselves at the mercy of officials who saw them not as future Roman citizens, but as walking profit margins. The corruption was breathtaking in its cruelty. Gothic families, already exhausted from their desperate journey, were told that food would cost them their most precious possessions. Roman officials demanded slaves in exchange for bread, and when the Goths had no slaves to give, they were forced to hand over their own children. Imagine the horror of a Gothic mother, watching her son or daughter disappear into Roman hands, all for a few days' worth of grain. But it got worse. These officials, drunk on their power over desperate people, began demanding weapons in exchange for basic supplies. Think about what this meant. They were disarming the very people they expected to serve as Roman soldiers. It was like asking someone to fight for you after you'd stolen their sword. The most sickening detail? When food ran short, some Roman officials actually sold the starving Goths dog meat, passing it off as regular provisions. Warriors who had once ruled their own lands were reduced to eating scraps fit for animals, all while Roman officials counted their profits. Word of this treatment spread through the Gothic camps like wildfire. These weren't just random refugees. These were people with a warrior culture, men who had earned their respect through battle, women who had raised children to be proud of their heritage. Every humiliation, every stolen child, every rotten meal was remembered and passed along. The Gothic leader Fritigern found himself in an impossible position. He had negotiated this deal with Rome in good faith, believing he was saving his people. Now he watched as that same people suffered under Roman cruelty. The pressure was building like steam in a sealed pot, and everyone could sense that something terrible was about to explode. What the Romans failed to understand was that they weren't just mistreating refugees. They were creating an army of enemies inside their own borders. Every Gothic warrior who watched his family starve, every father who lost a child to Roman slave traders, every proud person forced to grovel for scraps, they were all remembering, and they were all getting angry. The stage was set for catastrophe. The Huns had pushed the Goths into Roman territory. Roman greed had turned potential allies into bitter enemies, and now 200,000 displaced, angry, and desperate people were living inside the empire's borders. All it would take was one spark to turn this powder keg into an explosion that would shake the foundations of Rome itself. And that spark was about to come from the most unlikely source, the emperor's own burning desire for military glory. Sometimes history comes down to the clash between two very different kinds of men. On one side, you had Emperor Valens, a ruler desperately trying to prove himself worthy of the purple robes he wore. On the other, Fritigern, a Gothic king who had learned that survival sometimes required swallowing your pride and playing the long game. Let's start with Valens, because his story is almost tragic in its predictability. Picture a man in his early 50s ruling the eastern half of the Roman Empire, but always living in the shadow of greater men. His nephew Gratian ruled the Western Empire and had just won a stunning victory against the Alemanni tribe. The young emperor was being hailed as a military genius, and suddenly everyone was asking the uncomfortable question, what had Uncle Valens accomplished lately? This wasn't just political pressure, this was personal. Valens had spent years dealing with rebellions, administrative headaches, and the constant challenge of managing the empire's eastern frontier. He was competent, sure, but competent doesn't get you remembered in the history books. Competent doesn't get statues built in your honor or epic poems written about your deeds. When the Gothic crisis erupted, Valens saw his chance. Here was an opportunity to win the kind of decisive military victory that would cement his legacy. He could be the emperor who crushed the barbarian threat and restored Roman dominance. The temptation must have been overwhelming. Finally, a chance to step out of everyone else's shadow and into the light of glory. But here's what makes this so human and so tragic. Valens wasn't a bad emperor. He was actually pretty effective at running the day-to-day business of ruling. He just wanted to be remembered as something more than a capable administrator. He wanted to be a hero. Now, contrast this with Fritigern. This Gothic leader had already proven himself in ways that Valens never had. When the Huns came thundering across the steppes, Fritigern had made the hardest decision a leader can make. He chose his people's survival over his own pride. While other Gothic chiefs chose to fight and die gloriously, Fritigern chose the harder path of negotiation and compromise. Think about what this meant for a warrior culture leader. In Gothic society, your reputation was everything. A king who couldn't protect his people through strength was seen as weak. Yet Fritigern had the wisdom to see that sometimes retreat is the strongest move you can make. He swallowed his pride, approached the Romans, and made a deal that saved 200,000 Gothic lives. But then came the betrayal. Roman officials broke every promise they had made. They exploited, cheated, and humiliated the Gothic people. And here's where Fritigern's true character showed itself. Instead of exploding in righteous anger, he internalized the rage. He watched his people suffer, and he learned. Every slight, every broken promise, every child sold into slavery. Fritigern filed it all away. He was studying his enemies, understanding their weaknesses, waiting for the moment when patience would transform into power. While Roman officials congratulated themselves on their cleverness, Fritigern was quietly building something far more dangerous than an army. He was building a cause. The difference between these two men became crystal clear in the weeks before the battle. Valens received message after message from his advisors, all saying the same thing: wait. His nephew Gratian was marching with reinforcements. The Gothic position wasn't going anywhere. There was no strategic advantage to rushing into battle. But Valens couldn't wait. The glory he craved was right there, almost within reach. He could taste the victory speeches, imagine the triumphal processions, picture the historians writing about Emperor Valens the Great. Every day he delayed was another day for someone else to steal his moment. His generals tried to reason with him. They pointed out that the Gothic forces were larger than expected, that the terrain favored the enemy, that patience had won more battles than haste ever had. But Valens had spent too many years being reasonable, too many years being patient. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Meanwhile, Fritigern was doing something far more sophisticated. He was using Roman arrogance against them. He sent messages to Valens, sometimes aggressive, sometimes conciliatory, always carefully calculated to feed the emperor's ego while revealing nothing about Gothic intentions. He was like a chess master, moving pieces on a board that his opponent couldn't even see. The most brilliant part of Fritigern's strategy was how he used time itself as a weapon. Every hour that passed, more Gothic warriors arrived at the battlefield. Every delay meant his position grew stronger while Roman supplies ran lower. He turned negotiation into a form of warfare, using diplomatic talks to buy precious time for his forces to organize. Here's a detail that really shows the difference between these men. When Valens finally decided to attack, he didn't even know exactly how many enemies he was facing. Roman scouting had been rushed and incomplete. Fritigern, on the other hand, knew exactly how many Roman soldiers were marching toward him, what their battle formation would be, and how their supply lines were organized. On the morning of the battle, you had two leaders who had arrived at the same destination through completely different paths. Valens rode to battle burning with the need to prove himself, convinced that this was his appointment with destiny. Fritigern prepared for battle with the cold calculation of a man who had already lost everything once and refused to let it happen again. One man rushed toward glory. The other had learned that glory was nothing compared to survival. And in that fundamental difference lay the seeds of one of history's most devastating military disasters. The emperor's impatience was about to collide with the Gothic king's carefully prepared patience, and the Roman Empire would never be the same. August 9th, 378. The kind of sweltering summer day that makes armor feel like a furnace, and every breath taste like dust. By dawn, two armies faced each other across a stretch of rolling hills near the city of Adrianople, and the air itself seemed to tremble with anticipation. Valens had finally gotten his wish. Here was his chance for glory, his moment to prove that he deserved to be remembered alongside the great Roman emperors. As he looked out at his forces that morning, he must have felt a surge of confidence. 40,000 men stood ready to fight for Rome. Seasoned legionaries, skilled archers, and the pride of the Eastern Empire's cavalry. But if you looked closely, you could see the cracks in the Roman formation. These weren't the legendary legions that had conquered Gaul or crushed Carthage. Many of these soldiers had been hastily assembled, pulled from garrison duties and frontier posts. They were good fighters, but they hadn't trained together as a unit. They were like musicians who knew their individual parts but had never rehearsed as an orchestra. Fritigern, watching from the Gothic position, saw something else entirely. His people weren't just fighting for territory or treasure, they were fighting for their very existence. Every Gothic warrior on that field had watched Roman officials abuse their families. Every man there had a personal score to settle. That kind of motivation can turn ordinary soldiers into something far more dangerous. The Gothic position was brilliant in its simplicity. They had formed their wagon circle, called a logger, on slightly elevated ground. Think of it as a fortress made of wheels and wood, with families and supplies protected in the center and warriors defending the perimeter. From the Roman perspective below, it probably looked like a wooden wall bristling with spears and arrows. Here's where the first disaster struck, and it came from an unexpected source: Roman impatience. The plan was straightforward. The infantry would advance in formation while the cavalry provided support from the flanks. Basic tactics that had worked for centuries. But as the morning heat intensified and the two armies stared at each other across the field, someone made a fatal mistake. The Roman cavalry, probably suffering in their heavy armor under the blazing sun, decided they couldn't wait any longer. Without orders, without coordination, they spurred their horses forward in a wild charge toward the Gothic lines. Picture the scene. Hundreds of mounted warriors thundering across the field, their commander probably screaming at them to stop, but the momentum of battle already carrying them forward. It was exactly what Fritigern had been waiting for. The Gothic warriors behind their wagon wall weren't surprised or panicked. They were ready. As the Roman cavalry crashed into their defenses, Gothic spears and arrows met them in a devastating storm of steel and wood. Horses stumbled and fell, riders were yanked from their saddles, and what had started as a glorious charge became a chaotic retreat. But here's the truly catastrophic part. As the Roman cavalry fled back toward their own lines, they crashed right into the advancing infantry. Imagine being a legionary, marching forward in tight formation, suddenly having terrified horses and wounded riders plowing through your ranks. The careful battle lines that had taken hours to organize dissolved in minutes. The Roman infantry, now bunched together in confusion, became sitting ducks. Fritigern's warriors poured out from behind their wagons, and suddenly the Romans found themselves fighting not a defensive battle, but a brutal melee where their superior discipline meant nothing. When you're packed so tightly that you can barely swing your sword, all the training in the world won't save you. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became another enemy. Roman soldiers, weighed down by armor and shields, began to tire quickly. The Goths, fighting for their homes and families, seemed to find strength that the Romans couldn't match. What had started as a battle was becoming a slaughter. Through it all, Valens tried desperately to rally his forces. Reports describe him moving through the chaos, attempting to restore order to his disintegrating army. But the emperor who had dreamed of glorious victory found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The Gothic forces, sensing Roman weakness, pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency. As the afternoon wore on, the scope of the disaster became clear. This wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a complete collapse. Roman units that had fought together for years were scattered and broken. Officers who had served the empire faithfully for decades fell defending positions that were already lost. The Eastern Army, the pride of the Roman military, was being systematically destroyed. The most haunting part of the whole catastrophe was how quickly it happened. Military disasters often unfold slowly, with commanders having time to recognize problems and adapt. But at Adrianople, the Roman army went from organized formation to complete chaos in what felt like moments. It was like watching a house of cards collapse. Once the first pieces fell, everything else followed inevitably. As dusk approached, the field was littered with Roman dead. Conservative estimates put the losses at around 27,000 men, two-thirds of the entire Eastern army. But the numbers don't capture the human cost. These weren't just statistics. They were fathers and sons, men who had joined the legions believing they were serving something eternal and unbreakable. And somewhere in that carnage, Emperor Valens himself disappeared. The man who had sought glory so desperately that he ignored every warning, who had rushed to battle rather than wait for reinforcements, simply vanished into the chaos of his own making. Some accounts say he was wounded and taken to a nearby cottage, which the Goths then burned. Others claim he fell fighting in the thick of battle, his body so mutilated that it couldn't be identified. The truth is, nobody knows exactly what happened to Valens. His body was never found, never properly buried, never given the imperial funeral that was his due. The emperor who had wanted so badly to be remembered became a ghost, disappearing into the smoke and confusion of Rome's worst military disaster in centuries. As darkness fell on August 9th, the Gothic warriors walked among the dead, stripping armor from Roman corpses and counting the weapons of their enemies. They had done something that seemed impossible just hours before. They had destroyed a Roman army completely, utterly, and without mercy. The Battle of Adrianople was over. The Roman Empire would never be the same. But one thing was certain as the sun set on that terrible day. The age of Roman invincibility was over. The barbarians had proven they could not just resist Rome, but destroy it. And in the Gothic camps that night, as warriors celebrated their victory and mourned their own dead, everyone understood that the world had changed forever. Could this disaster have been avoided? What if Valens had waited for reinforcements, or if the cavalry had followed orders? The what-ifs of history are endlessly fascinating, and this battle offers plenty of them. Was Roman defeat inevitable once the Goths were mistreated? Or could different leadership have changed everything? These questions have intrigued historians for centuries, and they're still debated today. Drop your theories below, and if you're gripped by this tale, like this video and share it. Every click helps legacy of empires bring history to life. Picture this. The sun is setting over a battlefield littered with broken shields and fallen banners. The air is thick with dust and the metallic smell of blood. In the fading light, a Roman soldier lies dying, his armor dented, and his sword nowhere to be found. With his last breath, he whispers words that would haunt history. "Tell my son, I fought for nothing." This moment captures something profound about the Battle of Adrianople that goes beyond military tactics and political consequences. It's about the human cost of imperial pride and the crushing weight of meaningless sacrifice. Let's step into the sandals of Marcus, a fictional but representative legionnaire who might have fought that day. Marcus wasn't a noble or a general seeking glory. He was probably a farmer's son from somewhere in the Italian countryside, maybe 25 years old, with calloused hands and dreams of returning home with enough money to buy his own piece of land. Marcus had joined the legions because it promised steady pay, 3 square meals a day, and citizenship after 25 years of service. He'd been stationed on the Danube frontier for 3 years, watching the river and occasionally skirmishing with barbarian raiders. It was dangerous work, but it had purpose. He was defending the empire, protecting civilization itself. But on that August day in 378, everything changed. As Marcus formed up with his century that morning, he could sense something was wrong. The officers seemed nervous, constantly looking toward the Gothic positions on the high ground. Whispers ran through the ranks about how Emperor Valens had refused to wait for reinforcements, how he wanted all the glory for himself. Marcus had heard the stories about how badly the Gothic refugees had been treated. Roman officials had literally sold them dog meat while their children starved, then demanded their weapons and enslaved their families. Even a simple soldier could see this wasn't about defending Rome anymore. This was about an emperor's wounded pride. When the cavalry charged without orders, Marcus watched in horror as his mounted comrades were cut down or fled in panic. Then came the Gothic counterattack, and suddenly his well-ordered formation was chaos. Men were pressed so tightly together they couldn't even raise their weapons properly. The Gothic arrows fell like deadly rain. As Marcus felt the barbarian spear pierce his side, as he fell among his comrades and watched the proud eagles of Rome trampled in the dust, a terrible realization washed over him. He wasn't dying for Rome's glory or civilization's defense. He was dying because his emperor couldn't swallow his pride and wait for backup. The Gothic warriors stepping over his body weren't mindless savages. They were fathers and sons, too, fighting for their family's survival after Rome had betrayed them. In that moment, Marcus understood that this battle wasn't about good versus evil. It was about human failure on a massive scale. Tell my son, I fought for nothing. These words, whether spoken by a real soldier or imagined by a chronicler, capture the essence of Adrianople's tragedy. They speak to every parent who's ever worried about their children's future, every person who's ever questioned whether their sacrifices meant anything. Marcus's hypothetical son would grow up in a world where barbarian kingdoms carved up Roman territory, where the old certainties crumbled. He'd inherit a legacy of military defeat and political collapse. The father's sacrifice hadn't protected anything. It had only hastened the empire's fall. But here's what makes this moment so powerful. It multiplies across thousands of soldiers. Each man who died at Adrianople left behind families, dreams, unfulfilled promises. A blacksmith's apprentice who'd never forge his masterpiece. A young husband who'd never see his newborn daughter. A veteran 2 years from retirement who'd never buy that farm he'd dreamed about. Their deaths weren't just statistics in a military disaster. They were individual tragedies that shattered families and communities across the empire. Villages lost their young men. Widows struggled to feed their children. The human cost of imperial ambition played out in countless personal stories of loss and grief. What makes this soldier's dying words so haunting is how they speak to a universal human fear, that our struggles might be meaningless, that our sacrifices might serve no greater purpose. Every generation faces this question. Every parent wonders if they're building something worthwhile for their children. The soldier at Adrianople voices what many warriors throughout history have felt in their final moments. Not pride and glorious victory, but the bitter realization that they'd been used as pawns in someone else's game. His words remind us that behind every grand historical narrative are real people who paid the ultimate price for decisions they never made. That dying whisper echoes through the centuries, asking uncomfortable questions about power, pride, and the cost of empire. It challenges us to remember that history's great turning points were built on individual human stories, each one precious and irreplaceable. In the end, the Battle of Adrianople wasn't just about the fall of Rome. It was about the universal human experience of sacrifice, loss, and the search for meaning in the face of seemingly senseless tragedy. And sometimes, in our darkest moments, we all risk becoming that soldier, wondering if we've fought for nothing. Imagine the most powerful empire in history suddenly discovering it wasn't invincible anymore. That's exactly what happened after Adrianople. The defeat wasn't just a military loss that Rome could recover from with time and resources. It was something far more dangerous, a crack in the foundation of an empire that had stood for centuries. For over 400 years, Rome had been the undisputed master of the known world. Sure, they'd lost battles before, but they always bounced back stronger. The legions would regroup, march out again, and crush their enemies. It was the natural order of things, as predictable as sunrise. But after Adrianople, something fundamental changed. Picture Roman senators receiving the news in their marble halls, their faces pale with disbelief. 2/3 of the Eastern army destroyed, the emperor dead, his body never found. And most shocking of all, the Goths weren't retreating. They were dictating terms. For the first time in centuries, Rome had to negotiate from weakness. The empire that had once demanded tribute from kings now found itself begging barbarians for peace. It was like watching a giant discover his feet were made of clay. Here's where the story gets really interesting. The Goths didn't just want to raid and leave, they wanted to stay. Fritigern, the Gothic leader, was no fool. He understood that Rome's weakness was his opportunity to secure something his people had never had, a permanent homeland. So the Goths made Rome an offer the empire couldn't refuse. They would stop their rampage and even provide soldiers for Roman armies, but in exchange, they wanted their own territory within the empire's borders, not as subjects, but as allies. It was like a burglar not only robbing your house but then demanding to move into your guest room. The Romans, still reeling from their defeat, had no choice but to agree. Imagine the humiliation. Roman officials who had once governed provinces now had to treat barbarian chiefs as equals. Gothic warriors who had slaughtered Roman legions were suddenly being welcomed as federati, or federated allies. But accepting the Goths was just the beginning of Rome's troubles. The disaster at Adrianople had revealed a harsh truth. The empire simply didn't have enough Roman soldiers anymore. The old citizen-soldier tradition was dying. Young Romans increasingly preferred comfortable city life to the brutal realities of frontier warfare. So Rome did what seemed practical at the time. They hired more barbarians. Germanic tribes, Hunnic warriors, Allan cavalry, anyone willing to fight for Roman gold. It seemed like a smart solution. Why risk Roman lives when foreigners were eager to do the fighting? But here's the catch that Roman leaders didn't fully grasp. When you rely on mercenaries, you're not just buying their swords, you're also buying their loyalty, and loyalty can be expensive. These barbarian soldiers didn't share Rome's values or traditions. They fought for pay, not patriotism. What happened next was gradual but unstoppable. Picture a Roman general in the year 400, about 20 years after Adrianople. He looks at his army and realizes that most of his soldiers speak Germanic languages, worship different gods, and follow customs that would have horrified his grandfather. These barbarian soldiers brought their families, their traditions, their entire way of life into Roman territory. They settled in Roman cities, married Roman women, and raised children who were neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian. The empire wasn't just defending its borders anymore. It was being transformed from within. Roman commanders found themselves dependent on barbarian chiefs who commanded the loyalty of entire tribes. If a Germanic king decided to switch sides or demand more money, entire regions could be lost overnight. The empire that had once controlled its destiny now found itself at the mercy of foreign mercenaries. Adrianople's aftermath created a domino effect that would reshape Europe for centuries. As the Eastern Empire struggled to recover, pressure mounted on the western provinces. Barbarian tribes saw Rome's weakness and sensed opportunity. The Vandals pushed into Spain and North Africa. The Franks expanded into Gaul. The Saxons raided Britain. Each crisis required more barbarian allies to solve, which only deepened Rome's dependence on foreign soldiers. It was a vicious cycle. The more Rome relied on barbarians for protection, the more barbarian the empire became. The more barbarian it became, the less it resembled the civilization it was supposed to protect. By the early 5th century, less than 30 years after Adrianople, the transformation was undeniable. Gothic nobles held high positions in the Roman government. Barbarian generals commanded Roman armies. Germanic law began influencing Roman courts. The empire still existed on paper, but its character had fundamentally changed. Imagine being a Roman citizen during this period. Your grandfather might have served in legions that conquered distant lands. Your father might have governed provinces with absolute authority. But you? You found yourself bowing to barbarian kings who claimed to serve Rome while carving out their own kingdoms. The tragedy of Adrianople wasn't just that Rome lost a battle. It was that the defeat forced the empire to make choices that would ultimately destroy it. In their desperation to survive, Roman leaders invited the very forces that would eventually tear the empire apart. The Goths, who settled in Roman territory after Adrianople, didn't disappear. They multiplied, grew stronger, and eventually produced leaders like Alaric, who would sack Rome itself in 410. The barbarian mercenaries who seemed like salvation became the empire's gravediggers. This is why historians call Adrianople a wound that never healed. The battle didn't just kill Emperor Valens and his army, it killed something deeper: Rome's confidence in its own strength. Once that confidence was shattered, the empire began a slow slide toward collapse. The Western Empire would limp along for another century, but it was living on borrowed time. The Eastern Empire, later known as Byzantium, would survive much longer, but it too bore the scars of Adrianople. The age of Roman dominance was over, replaced by a new era where barbarian kingdoms ruled the lands that had once trembled before the eagle standards. In the end, Adrianople taught the world a harsh lesson. Even the mightiest empires can fall, not in a single catastrophic moment, but through a series of compromises that slowly erode everything they once stood for. The Goths didn't just defeat Rome on the battlefield. They showed that Rome's greatest enemy wasn't any foreign army, but the empire's own inability to adapt without losing its soul. Picture this. It's a scorching August day in the year 378, and the most powerful empire the world has ever known is about to make a mistake that will echo through the centuries. The Roman Empire, which had conquered lands from Britain to the deserts of Africa, was about to face a reckoning that no one saw coming. You see, empires don't usually fall in a single day. They crack slowly, like old marble under pressure. But sometimes, there's one moment when all those hairline fractures suddenly give way, and everything comes crashing down. For Rome, that moment was the Battle of Adrianople, and it all started with a desperate people fleeing for their lives. The Goths weren't originally Rome's enemies. They were a proud warrior people living peacefully beyond the Danube River, minding their own business. But then came the Huns, sweeping out of the eastern steppes like a hurricane of violence. These nomadic warriors struck terror into everyone they encountered, and the Goths found themselves caught between certain death and an uncertain future. With their homes burning behind them and their children crying from hunger, they did what any desperate people would do. They begged for help. When word reached Emperor Valens that 200,000 Gothic refugees were gathered at the Danube, pleading for sanctuary, he saw opportunity where he should have seen danger. Think about it from his perspective for a moment. Here were thousands of potential soldiers, farmers, and taxpayers practically throwing themselves at his feet. All he had to do was let them cross the river, settle them in empty lands, and Rome would be stronger than ever. It seemed like a win-win situation. But here's where human nature stepped in and ruined everything. Roman officials, the very people tasked with helping these desperate refugees, saw them as nothing more than walking profit margins. They sold the starving Goths rotten food at outrageous prices. They demanded Gothic children as slaves in exchange for basic supplies. Some sources even tell us they were selling dog meat to families who hadn't eaten in days, all while demanding payment in precious weapons and jewelry. Imagine being a Gothic father, watching your child waste away from hunger while Roman officials grew fat off your family's desperation. How long would it take before desperation turned to rage? How long before survival instinct kicked in and you decided that dying with dignity was better than living on your knees? The Gothic leader Fritigern tried to keep the peace. He genuinely wanted this arrangement to work. But when Roman greed pushed his people past their breaking point, he made a choice that would change history. The Goths rose up, not as conquerors seeking glory, but as a people who had nothing left to lose. Emperor Valens could have handled this crisis with wisdom. His nephew Gratian, the Western Emperor, was marching with reinforcements. Military advisors urged patience, but Valens was a man haunted by his own insecurities. His reign had been marked by military setbacks and political challenges. Here, finally, was his chance to prove himself as a great warrior emperor. Here was his opportunity to crush these ungrateful barbarians and remind the world why Rome ruled. So on that fateful August day, Valens marched his army toward Adrianople, convinced he was heading toward glory. He had no idea he was walking into his own tomb. The battle itself was a masterclass in how everything that can go wrong will go wrong. The Roman cavalry, perhaps feeling the heat of the day or the pressure of the moment, broke ranks and charged without orders. They slammed into the Gothic defenses like waves against a cliff, only to be thrown back in confusion. Meanwhile, Fritigern had positioned his people brilliantly on high ground, using the terrain like a chess master uses his pieces. As the Roman cavalry retreated in disorder, they crashed into their own infantry, creating chaos in the ranks. The disciplined Roman formations, which had conquered the world through precision and order, suddenly found themselves packed together like sheep in a pen. Then came the Gothic cavalry, thundering down from the hills like an avalanche of steel and fury. The Romans, already disorganized and demoralized, couldn't adapt quickly enough. What should have been a disciplined fighting withdrawal became a massacre. By sunset, 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army lay dead on the field. Among them was Emperor Valens himself, though his body was never found. Some say he died fighting like a common soldier. Others believe he was wounded and taken to a farmhouse that the Goths then burned, not knowing who was inside. The truth died with him that day. But the real tragedy of Adrianople wasn't just the lives lost or even the emperor's death. It was what it revealed about Rome itself. The empire that had once turned enemies into allies through strength and magnanimity had become petty and cruel. The military machine that had conquered the known world through discipline and innovation had grown complacent and rigid. After Adrianople, Rome was never the same. The Goths didn't disappear or retreat beyond the borders. They stayed, carving out their own kingdom within Roman territory. For the first time in centuries, barbarians were dictating terms to Rome. The empire that had once seemed eternal suddenly looked very mortal indeed. The irony is heartbreaking when you think about it. Rome had everything it needed to make peace with the Goths' work. There was empty land to settle them, a need for soldiers to defend the borders, and a long tradition of turning former enemies into loyal citizens. Instead, the short-sighted greed of a few officials and the pride of one emperor turned potential allies into the instruments of Rome's downfall. Adrianople teaches us something profound about power and pride. Empires, like people, often carry the seeds of their own destruction. The very qualities that make them great, ambition, confidence, the belief in their own superiority, can become fatal weaknesses when taken too far. Rome didn't fall because its enemies were stronger. It fell because it forgot the wisdom and restraint that had made it great in the first place. When we look back at that August day in 378, we're not just seeing the end of a battle or even the death of an emperor. We're witnessing the moment when the ancient world began its slow transformation into something entirely new. The age of Rome was ending, and the age of the barbarian kingdoms was beginning. And it all started with a simple choice between compassion and greed, between patience and pride. That's the real lesson of Adrianople. Sometimes the mightiest fall not because they're conquered from without, but because they're destroyed from within by their own worst impulses. Even eagles, when they forget how to soar, eventually learn how to fall. If this story of ambition and ruin moved you, like the video, subscribe, and join us next time as we unravel another chapter where history trembled. Until then, remember, even the mightiest can fall.